again, good evening, and welcome to our event, National Liberation and Imperialism's Crises. My name is Navid Farnia, and I'm with the Committee of Anti-Imperialists in Solidarity with Iran, or CASI, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. Now, before I introduce tonight's speakers, I do want to provide some background for this event and some context for our discussion on national liberation and imperialism. Now, the idea for this event came after the tragic helicopter crash on May 19th that killed Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, and the foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, among others. Now, in the aftermath of the crash, there's been widespread speculation about the possible causes, including that it was a tragic and unavoidable accident, and then on the other hand, that it was sabotage, particularly by the United States and or the Zionist regime of Israel. Now, at present, we don't know the direct cause of the crash, and we may never know with complete clarity. The Iranian government has been saying that it's more likely an accident, but it's not foolproof, and again, the investigation is ongoing. Nonetheless, I do want to explore both of these possibilities, this possibility of sabotage and the possibility of a genuine accident, to make the claim that imperialism is not innocent in either case. First, the claim that the crash was a result of sabotage operations is not a product of conspiracy theory. Rather, those of us who study and learn from history know that imperial and colonial regimes have committed such acts in the past. And I'll give one example. On October 19th, 1986, Mozambique's president, Samora Machel, was killed after his plane crashed into a mountain just inside of South Africa. South Africa and Mozambique share a border. Machel was an anti-imperialist who had helped lead Mozambique to independence from Portugal in 1975. He was also an enemy, therefore, of the apartheid regime in South Africa. Now, an investigation into the crash conducted by South Africa's apartheid government concluded that the crash which killed Machel and others was caused by pilot error. However, the Mozambican government rejected this explanation, and a separate investigation conducted by the Soviet Union concluded that the plane had strayed off course before it crashed into the mountain, and it strayed off course because of a decoy beacon deployed by South Africa. Okay? A former South African official even later claimed that he helped to bring about Machel's death. Now, despite all this, Machel's death does remain the topic of continued speculation, but there's significant evidence, including the evidence that I just mentioned, that challenges the apartheid regime's conclusions. So while the helicopter crash on May 19th may not have been sabotage, it's naive to outright reject the possibility. The second possibility is that the crash was a genuine accident. But even in this case, it's important to consider political context. Various analysts, including ex-government officials in Iran and world leaders, have made the point that the accident was a direct result of Western sanctions imposed against Iran, which has denied Iran the ability to buy new aircraft or even spare parts on the global market. So while we can't know the true cause of the crash, in both cases, whether sabotage or accident, imperialism has a clear responsibility. Now, this brings me back to the other main focus for tonight, which is national liberation. Iran's revolution in 1979 helped break the country free from the shackles of imperialism. Because of this, Iran has been able to make significant gains in the last 45 years, and especially in the past decade. However, as the crash last week, along with the bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus and Western sanctions have shown, the quest for national liberation is not yet fully complete. So tonight, we're going to explore the various manifestations of US imperialism and the struggle for national liberation in different historical and geopolitical contexts, ranging from Haiti and Algeria to Palestine and the Mexico-US border. We'll also discuss imperialism in its various manifestations, including colonialism, neocolonialism, and military occupation. And beyond all that, we highlight and elevate the resistance against imperialism, including in Palestine and Haiti, but also in locales that we won't even have time to explore tonight, from Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali in West Africa, to New Caledonia, a French colony in which the people have risen up against the colonial regime in recent weeks. and from the various struggles in West Asia, such as Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, to the struggle against imperialism in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The last couple of years have given rise to a new wave of national liberation struggles, and we want to emphasize this reality. Now, the topic of our first presentation will be Haiti, the site of the first successful national liberation struggle against Western imperialism in history. Haiti's revolution, which lasted from 1791 to 1804, had the double effect of eliminating slavery and ousting French colonialism from the island, in addition to getting rid of the other empires that sort of preyed upon the colony, including the British and the Spanish. But beyond all this, the Haitian Revolution fomented a crisis and really a contradiction in imperialism that resulted in the eventual demise of transatlantic slavery across the Atlantic world. Now, unfortunately, the Western powers have been punishing Haiti for this ever since and up to the present day, which leads into our first presentation and leads to my introduction of our first speaker, Dr. Jemima Pierre. Jemima Pierre is a professor of race and political economy at the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia, the Vancouver campus, and she's a research associate at the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. She's also the co-coordinator of the Haiti Americas team of the Black Alliance for Peace. And the topic of her presentation will be on Haiti's national sovereignty and also on global fragility. So I'll go ahead and hand over to Dr. Pierre. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Navid, for the introduction. I'm really grateful to be with you all for this important conversation. I am going to start. I have some notes written, so I'm just going to go ahead and read, and I look forward to your questions and conversation later. So not for the first time, the U.S. actions in the United Nations have exposed the wretched ineffectiveness of that international entity when it comes to defending the lives and rights of Palestinian peoples. For Palestine, this is nothing new. In fact, almost since the formation of the UN in 1945, the organization has repeatedly betrayed the Palestinian people, as the US has either bought or bullied UN member states into supporting the Zionists. Indeed, in the 1948 UN vote that endorsed the partition of Palestine was less an exercise of international democracy than a performance of corruption, coercion, and intimidation by the US superpower over smaller and weaker states. Two particular examples of this history of bullying and browbeating on behalf of Zionism are particularly painful: Liberia and Haiti. Haiti followed the US lead when it came to voting for partition in 1948, making both countries complicit in the inevitable decades of slaughter, emboldened and enabled by the UN decision. In a 1948 statement by Issa Nakhle, the representative of the Arab Higher Committee to the UN Palestine Commission, he asserted that Liberia was going to vote against partition. However, the Liberian delegate, Ellen Scarborough, changed her vote after she was threatened with physical violence, prompting her to ask for police protection. To explain Haiti's vote, however, it is worth hearing Nakhle's comments in full. Quote, "The delegate of Haiti on Wednesday made a very strong speech against partition on instructions from his government. On Saturday, however, he circulated a note to the delegations explaining that he is voting for partition in accordance with fresh instructions from his government. The Haitian delegate did not find words to describe his shame, and he was seen in tears in the lobby and delegates' lounge. Being a sincere and noble man, he could not hide the fact that his government surrendered to pressure and was forced into changing its instructions to him," end quote. In 1948, the reality that Haiti's sovereignty was nominal was reflected in its powerlessness against the overwhelming force of an imperial United States. In fact, Haiti was also a founding member of the League of Nations in 1919, while under US military occupation. And in 2024, Haiti's national sovereignty has been completely extinguished by the US. At all times, the United Nations and its predecessors served as conduits. In the few minutes that I have today, I want to focus on the current crisis in Haiti as a crisis of imperialism. But to understand what's going on to Haiti is to also remember that Haiti, born in 1804, represents the longest neo-colonial experiment in the history of the West. And for 2 centuries, imperial counterinsurgency against Haiti has aimed to terminate the most ambitious revolutionary experiment in the modern world. And I argue it's precisely Haiti's unique history as the US laboratory that makes it very difficult to see Haiti's contemporary predicament as one of colonialism and occupation, and of Haitian struggle as one for decolonization. So Haiti lost its nominal sovereignty late February 2004 through a US, France, Canada-led coup d'etat. The coup was then cleaned up by the United Nations, which under the leadership of UN Security Council permanent members US, France, the 2 countries that caused the coup d'etat, voted to dispatch so-called peacekeeping missions to Haiti. The 2004 occupation was then solidified through the creation and operationalization of the core group. Some claim that this occupation officially ended in 2017 with the formal drawdown of the mission, yet the UN has remained in Haiti through a new office and a new acronym, BINU, the United Nations Integrated Office in Haiti. Through the core group and BINU, Haiti is currently run by a group of non-Haitian foreigners. They are the very same people responsible for the destruction of Haiti's sovereignty and democracy. Under this 20-year foreign occupation, the Haitian state has been completely destroyed. Now, of course, democratic elections under military occupation are impossible. Thus, in 2011, the US forcibly changed election results and installed Michel Martelly and his political party, the PHTK. It is from the Martelly PHTK installation that we see the complete loss of even the veneer of Haitian democracy that the US and the West were trying to present to the world. Martelly's tenure was one of corruption and violence, and the attempted sell-off of Haitian land and resources to foreigners, and importantly, the disruption of Haiti's electoral cycle. By the time of the assassination of Haiti's president in 2021, Jovenel Moïse, who also came to power through undemocratic elections, there had not been regional and local elections since 2016. By the end of their terms, both Martelly and Moïse were ruling by decree. And once the core group installed Ariel Henry as Haiti's de facto prime minister in July 2021, the talk of elections was placed on a back burner. By late 2023, the terms of the last elected Haitian officials had expired. Haiti currently has no elected officials and no legitimate government. Thus, the manufacturing of a quote-unquote failed state under occupation. Yet it is difficult for many to understand that current calls for yet another intervention in Haiti are for the extension of US imperial occupation and the continued denial of Haitian sovereignty. What has also happened under the UN-US core group occupation of Haiti has been codified in a revamped new US foreign policy, a new Monroe Doctrine, if you will. It's called the Global Fragility Act. And this new policy, US officials have labeled Haiti as one of the world's most fragile states. And as such, it needs US tutelage to survive. The Global Fragility Act mandates an interagency approach among key players, including the USAID, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense and Treasury, amid collaboration with what they call, quote unquote, international allies and partners. In other words, the new US foreign policy objectives in the region is not to use its own military forces, but to use a combination of aid, funding, and militaries and police of other countries to carry out US objectives in the region. I must also point out here that the first 3 countries stated for the Global Fragility Act are Iraq, Libya, and Haiti. 3 countries that are actually 3 countries that are in their current position precisely because of US imperial actions. And Haiti is the first test site. So we see the working of the Global Fragility Act in the current call for military invasion in Haiti, where not only has the US enlisted the services of its servile neo-colonial states, Kenya, Benin, and the countries of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, but has also used the United Nations once again to justify the illegality of this call. One of the reasons that the brutal UN military occupation of Haiti that began in 2004 and continues One of the reasons that it could fly under the radar was because while it was initiated and largely funded by the US, France, Canada, the occupation was managed by the United Nations and covered by the discourse of multilateralism. And the most sinister aspect of this was that Haiti's sovereignty was extinguished by a multiracial coalition of Latin American, Caribbean, and African countries. Indeed, some simple facts of the coup and the violence of the international legal mechanisms used against Haiti and its people have been shamefully ignored. The refusal to acknowledge the occupation of Haiti reflects what Western imperialism reflects the ways that Western imperialism depends on what legal scholar China Miéville calls multilateralism as terror. Today, as Haiti faces another invasion, we must remember also that it was the United Nations that sanctioned this new military invasion, but dubiously insisted that it was a non-UN UN mission. This means, again, that multilateral terror is about to be unleashed on Haiti in the attempt to continue to stifle its sovereignty. The multinational Western-led occupation of Haiti that begins in 2004, and again that continues, should be considered the most successful exercise of neo-imperial sabotage. The US, France, and Canada were able to remove an elected and popular president, bypass the country's constitution, and over the past 20 years install prime ministers and presidents while overseeing the complete dismantling of the Haitian state. This was not by accident. And now we are to believe that the crisis in Haiti is about gangs and that violence on Haitian people and their sovereignty is the only possible solution. So we must reject this call for US and proxy intervention and further violence in Haiti. And we must remember that it is Haiti's history as the site of one of the longest struggles in the world for national liberation and Black sovereignty that puts it in this current position. This explains the US empire's constant reactionary onslaught against the people, punishing their repeated attempts at sovereignty with decades of instability designed to secure and expand US hegemony. So for 2 centuries, this counterinsurgency has continued. And the tactics deployed to attack Haitian sovereignty has been persistent and consistent. So the occupation continues, but so does our struggle for sovereignty and liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierre, for your wonderful presentation. And that helps also lead into our next presentation, which will cover the crisis at the Mexico-US border, which I'll introduce our speaker on that in a second. But I also want to say on that point, you mentioned sort of the complicity of certain Latin American countries and Caribbean countries in this occupation of Haiti. And it's ironic because Haiti was instrumental to the independence of many Latin American countries in the early 1800s, right? So there's this fraught relationship of that's going on here. I also want to point out, for those of you who aren't perhaps as familiar with the region, you might think about how Iran's sort of assistance to the Palestinian struggle in the same. I mean, it's different context, different sort of dynamics, but Haiti's sort of assistance to Latin American liberation and South America in particular it might be understood by thinking about what Iran is doing in West Asia today. And with all that, I will introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Alex Avina. Dr. Avina is an associate professor of Latin American history. His research focuses on armed struggle, the left, state terrorism, and the political economy of illicit drugs in 20th century Mexico. He also writes on topics dealing with the US-Mexico border, and his talk today is going to focus on the US-Mexico border and US imperialism past and present. Welcome, Dr. Avina.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Navid, for your kind words. In this short amount of time that I have to talk about the US-Mexico border, I just want to throw out a couple of ideas, and I look forward for people's feedback and comments and questions. There's 2 main points that I want to make today about the US-Mexico border. One is to think about this physical space as both an original generative site of US empire, going back to the US, to what in Mexico is referred to as the War of Northern Aggression, in the middle of the 19th century, but also as a site where we can kind of use it to trace both the rise, the consolidation, and the generation of contradictions within the US imperial project. And I'll get into in details in a little bit in terms of what I mean by that. But to think about how in the very idea of what the U.S. empire is, the U.S.-Mexico border is both a generative site of U.S. empire, but it's also a site that produces a lot of imperial anxiety. And recently, and in the last few decades, I see it as a place where a lot of the contradictions of U.S. imperial projects are coming home, right? So if we think of Aimé Césaire's idea of the colonial boomerang, I think about the U.S.-Mexico border as a place where that boomerang was launched, and we've seen it return. And as such, I think it's really important to think about the U.S.-Mexico borderlands region as a place where we can kind of track the relative status of U.S. empire, which I would say now is completely internally riven by a series of contradictions. The second main idea to throw out there is that one of these contradictions of US empire in terms of what it's produced, its consequences in Latin America and in the Caribbean especially, takes the form of the migrant, right? One of the ways to think about US empire in the Western Hemisphere is that everywhere US empire has gone, it has produced migrants, as the Puerto Rican journalist Juan Gonzalez refers to Latin American and Caribbean migrants to the US as a harvest of US empire. And to think about contemporary migrants coming to the US as potentially a 21st century form of transnational internationalism, right? And this is an idea that I'm shamelessly taking from the anthropologist Levi Vonk in his book Border Hacker. But to think about these migrant caravans that are experiencing horrific travails, traveling through large parts of the Americas to try to get into the United States, denied of the right to stay at home and live a life of dignity, free of violence, free of exploitation. These processes that are in many instances produced directly by US empire, particularly in the form of economic sanctions and economic warfare, particularly in the case of Venezuela, in Cuba, and other countries that have been put under US sanctions in the last decades. These migrant caravans in their diversity, national and regional diversities, potentially might get us to think about what internationalism in the 21st century will look like. And not just in their configuration, not just in how these caravans have been organized and produced and how they work together across linguistic and national lines, but also the type of response that they elicit. And one of these responses that we've witnessed, to go back to my first point, is the erection of the wall, right? And the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border that has been built since the early 20th century, that we see now most prominently exemplified by Donald Trump's call for that, quote, big beautiful wall, which that to me, and we can hopefully we can discuss this, is a paramount sign of U.S. imperial decline and anxiety. Again, the idea that U.S. imperial policies in Latin America and the Caribbean generates the very contradictions or seeds of its potential demise. One of those contradictions is the creation of these migrant caravans that were produced by things like economic warfare and economic sanctions in the last few decades. In previous decades, in the previous century, these movement of peoples who were denied the right to stay and live in their homes by U.S. invasion and intervention, beginning with the U.S. invasion of Mexico in the middle of the 19th century. To go back to my first point about the U.S.-Mexico border as a generative site of U.S. empire, but also a place where we can kind of track its contradictions. The very idea of the United States, right, it gets formed to a certain extent during the American Revolution. One of the things that made these settler colonists mad was the fact that their imperial overlords prevented them from crossing a frontier, from crossing a border, and to destabilize British alliances with different Native American polities, right? So it's in a certain extent, it's in the quote unquote DNA of this nation that the border or the frontier is a generative site of U.S. imperial imagination. This constant expansion westward, this constant expansion southward into the Americas, the constant expansion westward that leads to the Pacific, with always toward an eye toward markets, particularly in China. So the U.S.-Mexico border is one of the places where all of this processes began. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century, from the very moment that the U.S. invades Mexico in 1846, by February of 1848, you have the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. One of the reasons why that war broke out the way that it did, why it turned out the way that it did, was both of these countries had only aspirational sovereign claims over the lands that defined them. For much of the 19th century, the actual political military force in the US-Mexico borderlands consisted of different powerful Native American polities who really shaped the outcome of that war in favor of the United States. There's a really interesting part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that resolved the end of the war, that led to the loss of half of Mexico's national territory to the United States, that placed the responsibility of stopping cross-border Native raids on the United States. And 5-6 years later, by the 1850s, the United States figured out that that was an impossible task. Even when map drawing commissions from both countries went out and tried to map the current US-Mexico borderlands, there were some instances where they had to ask permission from Native American polities to even conduct their work. So one of the things that we've seen, one of these processes that we've seen in the last 150 years or so, is the actual material creation of something that we refer to as the US-Mexico border. And it's been a long, drawn-out process of militarization, of wall building, of conquest, and of plunder in this borderland space that that now is about a few hours drive where I'm currently living. And I'll come back to this point a little bit at the end, but there's a reason why some journalists like Jimmy Johnson have referred to the US-Mexico border as the Mexico-Palestine border. I'm a few hours drive away from 50 plus Elbit fixed surveillance towers that monitor the Arizona-Mexico border. And that's without even getting into different drone technology and the different type of police training that Border Patrol officers have received in Israel. So again, if we think about the US-Mexico border as this generative site of US empire, it shows us that it shows us how these different imperial configurations on the ground here have a global echo and a global resonance that we continue to see to this day. The very materiality of the US-Mexico border as it develops throughout the 20th century embodies how US empire and US imperial expansion takes place throughout the century. For instance, in 1945, you had the first building of a chain link fence on the California-Mexico border. That fence used or recycled the very materials that they had used in Japanese internment camps. During the 1970s, during the US genocidal war against Vietnam, the border technology, McNamara's line that the US tried to install in Vietnam to divide the North and the South failed miserably in that context, but that same technology was brought back in the 1970s and 1980s and set up along the US-Mexico border. And by the 1990s, when we get increased militarization and wall building on the US-Mexico border, helicopter landing pads that were used by the Americans in Vietnam are brought back, repurposed, and set on the US-Mexico border. So the very materiality of this border tells us something about the history of US imperial expansion. Where we are now, I think going back to the other one of the first points that I made in terms of this border is also a site of where we get to see the contradictions of US empire. Beginning in 2010 or 11, there was a lot of US media attention drawn to the rapid emergence of Central American migrants coming to the United States throughout the 2010s. And one of the things that was really missing in the public discussion about why tens of thousands of people from Central America were coming was just a little bit of history. And that history has to do with what the US under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s especially were doing in the region to support and prop up death squad regimes that were committing genocide against indigenous peoples in Guatemala and supporting death squads who were wiping out revolutionary movements throughout the region. And the actions of US empire to decimate an entire region in the 1980s came back in 2010s in the form of people who were fleeing conditions, horrific conditions of violence and exploitation that were created by US empire in the first place. Only when they get to the United States, when they get to the US-Mexico border, they're told, do not come, you're not welcome, you're not allowed in. That is, and we've seen this continuously, right? We're in a crazy election year in the United States where there's an entire demonization of asylum seekers, of refugees, with very little historical context applied to why these people are coming in the first place. And those reasons are directly tied to US empire throughout Latin America and throughout the Caribbean, in particular, because of economic warfare and economic sanctions levied against very specific countries. If we think about US empire, and this is conversation about US empire in decline, the US-Mexico border has always been US empire soft underbelly. It's always been its most vulnerable point. It's always been where Americans have demonstrated its most anxious, or it's demonstrated its anxiety over its status as an empire. And this is why we see the increasing militarization. This is why we see this weird tautology where the more secure and militarized the border becomes, the less insecure and more open it becomes in political discourse. And we have this weird dynamic that fuels both a border industrial complex, but also fuels a really toxic domestic politics. But throughout the 20th century, the US-Mexico border has been the soft underbelly of US empire. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we should pay more attention to it through the lens of foreign policy, through the lens of US imperial policy, and not just through domestic politics. Of course, if we only had an actual anti-imperialist state or government in Mexico, that would really, I think, heighten the contradictions. It would really illustrate the weakness of a region that throughout the 20th century, particularly after World War II, American policymakers were constantly referred to as the American Maginot Line. They knew that this was a site of weakness. And this anxiety is only going to continue to mount. And one of the reasons, more recent reasons, and I'll end here, has been because of massive amounts of displacement caused by climate change. And I think we should really, and this is something that allows us to connect to what's going on with the genocide in Gaza. In the last COP28 meeting, Colombian President Gustavo Petro, I think, laid out an accurate diagnostic of where we're at, and it allows us to connect how migration and how settler colonialism, how US empire is connected to climate, and leaving us with climate change, and leaving us really with that old question or set to us by Rosa Luxemburg in the Junius pamphlet decades ago, in terms of where do we go from here? It's either socialism or barbarism. And Gustavo Petro, I think, was one of these leaders that really managed to connect the dots. And I'll use his comments to kind of to end my intervention. At the COP28 in December of last year, he said, quote, "This immense exodus will have a response in the North. We are already seeing it in the anti-immigration policies of rich countries and the rise of extreme right within them. Hitler is knocking on the European and American middle-class homes' doors, and many are letting him in. The exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. We can then see the future, the breakdown of democracy and the barbarism unleashed against our people, the people who do not emit CO2, the poor people. Is this future of a generalized Gaza against the growing exodus of our people avoidable?" Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avina, for your, again, another wonderful presentation, particularly for us to think about your framing of the border, for us to think about as both a site of a generative site for US empire, but also a site of crisis and indeed contradictions. Our next presentation will also explore resistance, both, I guess, in a historical and in a contemporary fashion. Our next presenter is Brahim Rouabah. Brahim is a PhD candidate in political science at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where he's also the co-chair-elect of the Doctoral and Graduate Student Council. Brahim's research interests revolve around popular movements, theory, and knowledge production. His work interrogates the effects of neocolonialism and imperialism on Global South peoples and societies. He's a co-founder and former head of the UK-based Algeria Solidarity Campaign and the current board member of the Paris-based France Fanon Foundation. Brahim's writings have appeared in such publications as the Review of African Political Economy, Middle East Law and Governance, and Africa as a Country, among others. Welcome, Brahim. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Navid, for that introduction. I've learned so of course, like honored to be in the company of such great minds, and I've learned so much so far from the presentations that went before me. I don't have a talk per se, but I have a couple of points that I think I myself try to remind myself of, and concepts and discourses that maintain the current sort of neo-colonial imperialist planetary order, and I feel like going back to basics can at times be very beneficial. One thing I want to start with is the process of decolonization in the middle of the 20th century. Of course, there is a longer history to that, with as we've heard in Haiti, and also in parts of Latin America. But in Africa, Asia, the 20th century, really middle of the 20th century, is the sort of the moment where that sort of movement takes global proportions. And I think the decolonization movement is at times really lacks appreciation. I don't think we appreciate enough the gains that were made by that movement, and they are still, peoples of the global South are still trying to protect in the face of this imperialist onslaught. So we think with the decolonization as a global revolution against centuries-old racial capitalist, settler colonial, white supremacist world order, has been accompanied with a colonial counter-revolution. So the colonial powers, since World War II at least, they have done everything to maintain the colonial order, or at least ensure that whatever process the decolonization takes, or orientation, that it's emptied of its liberatory and emancipatory content. And that happened at two levels: a discursive level, where decolonization is spoken of as a failure, and sort of the promotion of this idea that colonialism is better than national liberation, and or also if that fails, then at least there is the promotion of the idea that decolonization, now that the global South is decolonized, it ought to aspire to emulate the global North model of development. And one of the main gains of decolonization in the 20th century has been the recommoning of colonial dispossession. And for imperialism, it reaches a moment of crisis when it's confronted with walls that prevent it from its expansion in terms of access to resources, access to markets, and just spaces to project more of its power. And the recommoning that happened with the decolonization movement has been the target really of that. So for imperialism, it needs to bring down the walls that were erected by peoples of the global south to protect their dignity, to protect their resources, and to protect their community and their very existence. In the case of Algeria, at least the Algerian revolution, anti-colonial revolution, something that was also very important is the advocacy for a more just global order, and the normalization of the people's rights, oppressed people's rights to armed resistance, something that has been subjected to a relentless onslaught by the colonial counter-revolution, a principle that has suffered this onslaught. And today, to the point that where we got today, especially in the case of Palestine, that Zionists, both in Israel or in the global north, drill this idea that somehow a settler colony that dispossesses, genocides, and decimates indigenous populations has the right to exist. And they want to also inculcate the idea that that resistance, the right of the oppressed people, the people who are subjected to this dispossession, to this slaughter, to resist, and the means that they choose to resist are criminalized and are, so colonialism in very few words, colonialism is a right nowadays, or so the mantra goes, and resistance to it is a crime. So with the Algerian revolution, I think the contribution was given the confidence to, or contributing to the global sort of decolonization movement, and allowing peoples of the global south to be proud of the struggles of their ancestors, and to stand up to speak truth to power and stand up to imperial arrogance, and to do so normalize also the right to resist by any means necessary. So that's as far as sort of the advocacy that happened also in international institutions, such as the UN and the various sort of international law mechanisms that global South countries have pushed for and have managed to enshrine this right, which is currently no longer working for imperialism. And when I say imperialism here, also with World War II, at least you had the colonial portfolio that was managed by the British and the French somewhat changed hands, and the US sort of took the lead on a global stage. Up until then, the US's role was more regional in the Americas, but it's really after World War II that sort of the scope of its involvement took a global proportions, and in some ways it has been at the forefront of this colonial counter-revolution, which essentially translates into the extension of the Monroe Doctrine to the rest of the world. So with the gains, both ideological and material, that were made by the decolonization movement, sovereignty over resources, over land, essentially the sort of the spacing project. It is true, it has taken the form of nation states, but nonetheless, it is a form of recombinant and the gains that were made with that, such as national sovereignty and over resources and land, are not negligible gains. And for now, and the right to resist and to resist colonialism, including by armed means, which has been again the focus of the colonial counter-revolution, especially in its latest phase in the last 2 decades with the so-called global war on terror, where ideologically not only there is a criminalization of a resort to armed resistance, but also ideologically making it also almost morally unacceptable that colonial violence, genocidal violence, as we're witnessing today in Gaza, is necessary. It's a necessary evil for a better world somehow. But the violence of victims resisting that unjust genocidal violence is condemned. So also, yeah, that's as far as the discursive aspect goes. Materially, however, what the Algerian experience also teaches us is that the key to bringing down or making a dent, at least, in the imperialist world order is to make it materially unsustainable for it to continue oppressing the world. In the case of Algeria, again in the 50s, with the armed resistance to French colonialism, by the late 50s, it was made prohibitively costly for the French to maintain Algeria as a colony, both in terms of the human toll, but also in terms of resources, whereby by the late 50s, you have more than 500,000 French soldiers in Algeria, not to count police and other paramilitary groups. And France was essentially spending hundreds of millions or billions of francs back then to maintain order in Algeria, and that made it unsustainable. And I think the crisis of imperialism today revolves around similar principles, albeit at a different scale, whereby the expansion that the U.S. imperialism needs requires that it brings down the walls that prevents it from accessing spaces that had been liberated by the blood and sweat of the downtrodden and the wretched of the earth. That includes places like China and Russia, but also Iran, Haiti, Algeria, Burkina Faso, Niger, Libya, Syria, any space that was taken out of the colonial portfolio to a certain extent has now to be the space in which imperial or imperialist expansion happens. And it is not able to do that because there is an understanding, and thanks to the accumulation of generational struggles that jealously safeguarded the gains of decolonization, U.S. imperialism is no longer able to get its will. And it is throwing a fit, like a kid, essentially, who's used to getting its way, and is no longer able to get what it wants. Therefore, it resorts to throwing tantrums, and those tantrums can be extremely destructive. So And the genocide, I suppose, in Palestine today, in Gaza, is not really an exception. I mean, there is something particular about it, you know, in terms of timing and the technological sort of wherewithal that is at people's disposal for it to be streamed. And but genocide, in principle, is the corollary of you know, racial capitalist colonialism. That's how you get. That's how you expand. There is no, you know, this idea, this Wall Street idea of creating wealth as if it happens out of thin air is a myth. You steal wealth, and you enclose upon wealth. So, you know, and I think in the case of the regional resistance nowadays, especially around Palestine and the involvement of Iran in safeguarding a third worldist tricontinental decolonial spirit, and it's really spearheading it in terms of its support of resistance movements in the region and beyond, even in Latin America, entertaining excellent relations with the axis of resistance, if you will. And today they are making it impossible for the U.S. to get its way in the region, and making it materially costly for empire to just order everyone around in the region. So as Ayad mentioned, with we've seen incredible steadfastness in Palestine, in Iran, in Yemen, who has really changed the rule, you know, the rules of the game, whereby it is probably the first time in history that you have you control the flow, maritime flow, without having a strong navy, which is the costliest sort of thing that a state can possess. But it has really, since the steamship, this is probably the use of drones and the use of missiles, surface to sea missiles, has changed the material conditions for global maritime security. And changing those material realities is what you know, what puts limits on the arrogance and voraciousness of imperialist powers. So I think I'll end it there with those, and then if there is anything during the Q&A, I'll be more than happy to expand on.
Thank you so much, Brahim. Again, really appreciate your presentation. Your point about the accumulation of the gains of generations of struggle leading to the decline of U.S. imperialism, I think, is very important. And your point about Yemen, you know, again, they shot down another drone today. So, you know, so just wanted to point that out. So this leads to our last presentation, last but not least. Charlotte Cates. Charlotte Cates is the international coordinator of Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. She also works with the International Committee of the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian BDS Coalition. She worked on the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism and is also a founding member of CASI. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you so much to Navid, and thank you so much to all of the speakers who have gone before. It's really a difficult act to follow, and I am really looking forward to the questions and discussions to probe even further into the incisive and challenging ideas that all of you have raised as part of this discussion. I'm going to speak a little bit today on the issue specifically of the International Criminal Court and the ways in which law have intersected with particularly the Palestinian Palestinian struggle for liberation, but overall with national liberation movements that are fundamentally fighting US imperialism, fighting US-led imperialism on a global scale. And whether these legal systems that have been set up in the current international legal order and the previous international legal order are capable of addressing the needs and concerns of liberation movements and of peoples. And of course, it is without question that the Palestinian movement has been demanding for years that the leaders of the Zionist regime and that the Zionist regime itself be held accountable in international courts. Whether that is through efforts like we see that South Africa is pursuing at the International Court of Justice, which is a somewhat different court system because it's a state-to-state court system, or whether it is what we've seen Karim Khan, the lead prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, announce most recently, or for that matter, within various national courts through principles of universal jurisdiction, that this use of international courts to hold leaders of the Zionist regime accountable has been a demand of Palestinian political organizations, human rights organizations, and even resistance organizations throughout the years. And so when we saw, as Iyad said, on May 20th of this year, ICC prosecutor Karim Khan, who is of course a British lawyer and who was the candidate for ICC prosecutor, who was supported by the United States, Britain, and their allies, of course, and supported by the United States, despite the fact that the US has always refused to be bound by the International Criminal Court, even as it has supported its use against various people and leaders in Africa in particular. And of course, vocally supported the arrest warrant issued against Russian President Vladimir Putin and other Russians, despite the fact that the US not only refuses to be subjected to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, but has gone so far as to pass law that it will invade the Netherlands if US officials are brought before the International Court to be held accountable. So, of course, as we all know, when we hear US officials speak about the so-called rules-based international order, what they're speaking about is not just the limitations of international law and its development in the context of colonialism and settler colonialism, its development and advancement by imperialist powers at the same time that they're extracting wealth and resources from the people of the world, but a replacement even of that form of international law that was developed in the era of anti-colonial struggle, that was developed in the era of national liberation movements, that was developed in the era of contestation between the United States and the Soviet Union, to replace that instead with a so-called international order in which the United States and its partners make the rules and everyone else is expected to get an order and follow them. And of course, what we have seen around the world and what we are seeing today is completely the opposite of that reality. That despite the brutality, violence, and massacres, despite the vicious genocide that is currently being carried out by the United States and its Zionist colony at this moment in occupied Palestine, particularly in Gaza, despite the daily threat to invade Haiti directly after imposing so much destruction over the years on Haiti, despite the theft of Latin America's wealth and resources and people that has developed into forced migration, and then the victims of that forced migration demonized and targeted. Despite all of these attacks, what we are also seeing is an imperial power that is unable to comfortably retain its position, that is becoming, in many ways, increasingly brutal, dangerous, and desperate in its willingness to commit any crime at all in order to maintain its power and in order to be able to continue its theft and mass extraction of labor, wealth, and resources from the people and nations of the world. And of course, we see that right now centered in occupied Palestine. And we see that centered certainly also in the realm of law. So when we look at who the International Criminal Court has prosecuted and who the International Criminal Court does not prosecute it, we can see consistently that those who are prosecuted are those who are subjected to imperialism, whereas when the people of the world seek to hold the imperialists accountable, their cases are denied, relegated, rendered insignificant, or explicitly moved down and dropped down, deprioritized. So for example, in Afghanistan, which has acceded to the Rome Statute to seek, Karim Khan officially announced that he is going to prioritize cases against the Taliban, particularly after Afghanistan once and for all kicked out all of its US and fellow Western invading imperialist forces. But those cases against the US and the British were going to be deprioritized. And that was just a very open statement that the priority is to prosecute those who liberate their land and those who fight imperialism. And that the purpose of the court was always to hold those accountable and never to hold accountable the imperialist directors themselves. So this is why it's so interesting, and as Iyad said earlier, frankly, quite obviously, an achievement of the Al-Aqsa flood, of the October 7th operation, of the resistance that has not been defeated in Palestine for the past 8 months, despite the massive genocide, and when it is clear that the Zionist regime is able to bomb and attack and destroy schools, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, churches, and residential buildings, but is entirely incapable of destroying or even significantly affecting the military capacities and capabilities of the resistance, which is rooted in the people as well as it is rooted in the land and under the ground, that continues to destroy tanks, that continues to destroy regiments, that continues to take captives from the Zionist invading soldiers, making clear on a daily basis that the so-called superiority of the Zionist army, the thing that was exposed so vividly on October 7th, 2023, is just as exposed today. And the mass murder of civilians does nothing to cover over the fact that the Zionist army is completely incapable of destroying the resistance. At the same time, what has begun to happen in Palestine is that the resistance has raised the stakes. And of course, the Palestinian resistance is at the center of raising the stakes. But as fellow speakers have already made clear, the Palestinian resistance is not alone in this regard. It's part of an alliance of resistance, an axis of resistance, and a front, a camp of resistance that brings together all of the forces in the region that reject imperialism, Zionism, or their status as reactionary Arab regimes that receive benefits in exchange for facilitating the interests of imperialism and Zionism in the region. And so we see these resistance forces having true unity on all fronts, true unity of the fronts in which they are acting together to confront imperialism and to confront Zionism. And so when we look at the 7th of October, what we see is a day of military action that was planned, that was strategized, that was clear in its goals, and that was brave and self-sacrificing. And what we also see when we look at the 7th of October, 2023, is that this was a very visible example of the clear possibility to see a Palestine that was free of Zionism and a region that was free of US imperialism. That despite all of the billions of dollars in tanks and guns and weaponry, it was quite possible for guerrilla struggle and guerrilla movements to fight back, to break down the walls, to go through the fences, and to shatter the illusion of the invincibility of Zionism and imperialism. So when we see these warrants being issued for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, those arrest warrants are being sought for 2 reasons. One, they're certainly being sought to appease the mass movements around the world, not only the forces of resistance in the region, but we are increasingly seeing an international camp of resistance. and an international popular cradle of resistance that stretches from student encampments at universities and colleges in the heart of the belly of the beast to labor unions in Brazil, to dock workers in Belgium and Barcelona and Spain, to labor unions in India that refuse to allow Indian workers to be sent to become replacements for Palestinian workers in the Zionist colony, to South Africa and its insistence on demanding international accountability for the Zionist regime in international courts. When we see this growing international camp of resistance, the fractures that are clear in the framework of Zionism and imperialism, their increasing contradictions with one another are being reflected in everywhere around the world. And so we are beginning to get to the point where imperialist powers are actually seeing that it may no longer be viable to maintain everything about their colonial project. In fact, many of them find people like Netanyahu in particular to be poor strategists for imperialism because they are too concerned for their own political interest and not concerned for the future of the Zionist project and for the future of imperialist hegemony in the region. And so Netanyahu is increasingly expendable because the Zionist project is not expendable for them. And the Zionist project will not be reformed away and will not be held accountable in the courts, but it will need to be defeated directly by the resistance and by the growing Palestinian and regional revolution. But of course, these warrants against, so when we say, why are these warrants issued? Well, because there's a problem for the imperialist powers, and they're increasingly looking for a way to solve it, and they are in dispute with one another about how to solve it. And also because Netanyahu is personally expendable in order to save Zionism and in order to save imperialism. But of course, we do not see, despite the 40,000 dead, despite the scenes of every hospital in Gaza destroyed, despite the mass expulsion to Rafah of the vast majority of the population of Gaza, despite all of the war crimes, despite the beheaded children and the skin burning from bodies, despite the horrors of doctors tortured to death, despite the mass graves outside hospitals with people still attached to IVs buried within, despite the scenes of 1,000-year-old mosques razed to the ground, despite the scenes of Zionist soldiers blowing up universities and setting books on fire. No. The argument is that both sides need to be prosecuted. And so therefore we saw also the issuance of warrants or the seeking of arrest warrants against 3 leaders of the Palestinian resistance, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, and Ismail Haniyeh. And so it's important for us to be clear that there can be no equation made between the legitimate resistance of the Palestinian people and their leadership and the illegitimate Zionist colonizer. You know, we've heard Zionists and imperialists from the other side make the argument that there can be no equation between Hamas and Netanyahu. And yes, that is true. There can be no equation between Hamas and Netanyahu because Hamas is one of the leading forces in a resistance movement, in a popular revolution that has every right to fight for its people and their liberation using all tactics, including armed struggle. And the Zionist colony is an illegitimate colonial settler regime implanted by imperialism in Palestine and in the heart of the region in order to deprive the Arab nation and the Iranian nation of true self-determination and control over their future and destiny. So there can be no equation between these forces, and it is not evening things out in order for the International Court, the Criminal Court, to make those decisions. It is, in fact, an attempt to deny the fundamental right of the Palestinian people to resist and to win their liberation. And it is up to us to recognize that we cannot look to the International Criminal Court and these institutions to win justice. Instead, the question must be, how do we build support and how do we build the international popular cradle of the resistance in a way that supports and sustains those forces that are actually making this change possible? We have seen that the resistance in Palestine expressed its willingness. I mean, Hamas said openly, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine said openly that we are willing to face the International Criminal Court as long as there is an attempt to meaningfully pursue justice against the occupiers. And certainly this is also true because any fair court and any fair trial would certainly not indict nor convict the leadership of the resistance for defending their people and their land and seeking their liberation. But of course, the question is that we are not speaking about a just and impartial court. We are speaking about a political mechanism that exists in the era of imperialism. And so the fact that the resistance is willing to sacrifice for Palestine does not legitimize or justify the actions of Karim Khan and the International Criminal Court. In fact, in his statement seeking these arrest warrants, he repeatedly referenced the rights of Zionist colonizers to self-defense, a so-called right which does not exist against the people it is occupying and colonizing, even under the limitations of international law, without referring to the right of the Palestinian people to resist and to liberate themselves through armed struggle, despite the fact that that right is supported in international law. It is, of course, because of the resistance itself, because of the sacrifices of the resistance fighters, because of the commitment of the soldiers of Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Movement, Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, the Ansar Allah movement, government, armed forces, and people of Yemen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, that all, certainly the people and nation of Iran, all of these forces, the forces that are labeled by the United States, the European Union, Canada, and Britain as terrorists, that there is any source of, in the region, of any source of defense of humanity or a future for justice and dignity for the people of the region and indeed for the people of the world. What we have seen is that the bravery, creativity, and revolutionary steadfastness of the Palestinian and regional resistance, particularly through the armed struggle, has reset the balance of power so that the crimes of the occupier can no longer be greeted with nothing but impunity and silence and approval. And we have seen that attempts to greet the crimes of the occupier with impunity, silence, and approval are met with what we are seeing as a growing global intifada. This is a term that the student movement in Gaza itself applied to the student encampments. They called it the student intifada. They've continued to call it the student intifada. And so that's a global intifada that is led by the resistance. And so it is our duty here to talk about being in service to the resistance and emphasizing and expanding that intifada until it is a true crisis for imperialism so that it has no potential to continue its genocidal assault on the Palestinian people and in fact on all of the peoples of the world. The achievements that can be framed as legal achievements are not brought about by the objective application of law, but by the changes in reality that have been brought about by the armed struggle. This is an international popular cradle of the resistance that can be part of and contribute to the resistance on the ground from the imperial core. The choice is also notable to seek warrants only against Netanyahu and Gallant. We do not see warrants, we do not see a request for warrants against Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Isaac Herzog, Herzi Halevi, and other war criminals. This means that it's meant to leave a political leadership intact for the Zionist regime. These include the head of the IDF, the IOF, I should say. These include the many officials that have been routinely and publicly calling and asserting their desire for the genocide of the Palestinian people. In fact, it seems intended to clear the road for a Gantz or Lapid or similar prime ministership of the Zionist regime. It is clear that many sectors of the security establishments of both the Zionist regime and the imperialist project overall think that Netanyahu is a bad choice for the future of the imperialist project. They are not so committed to his personal political future. They're committed to the choices that they see as necessary to maintain the ability to prop up a declining, failing, and increasingly fraught with internal crisis Zionist project. If we look at the streets of so-called Israel, we see these ongoing political battles, no sense of national unity, no sense of common cause, just a fascist escalation, and to the extent that Zionist parties and individuals compete with each other to see who can post the more disgusting and abhorrent content. We see the mass imprisonment of Palestinians, that there are 10,000 Palestinians held in regular Zionist jails, but there are also thousands of Palestinians that have been taken to concentration camps outside Gaza. At least 50 have been killed under interrogation. We see cases like that of Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, a prominent physician who was beloved by everybody, who was known for his willingness to treat people, his willingness to not sleep and not rest until they could give their patients the best treatment he could, who was murdered and martyred under interrogation by the Zionist regime. We see soldiers posting their TikToks, stealing women's clothes, stealing jewelry, playing with children's toys of the children that they have killed. This is the nature of the Zionist regime today. It's a degraded fascist entity that exists because it is propped up by billions of dollars in US weaponry. And on the other hand, what we see is the Palestinian people and their resistance forces living through genocide, facing the most unlivable of human conditions, without water, without food, without electricity, without their homes, living under the rubble, and yet continuing to be more united than ever on the path of resistance, on the path of revolution, rejecting Zionism in its entirety, and insisting on the armed struggle until the liberation of Palestine. United not just for the liberation of Palestine, but quite frankly, for the liberation of humanity. The imperialist powers that have threatened a war against the ICC, we of course see that being reflected by the congressional Republicans and even members of the Democratic Party who are, waving their threats on Twitter and in statements against the ICC for indicting Netanyahu. But at the same time, so that is the part that the resistance took. The resistance has taken that seeking of indictments against Netanyahu and against Gallant. That is not something that was given by the imperialists. That is not something that was given by the ICC. That was something that was taken by the resistance and by the growing movement. And the attempt to also seek arrest warrants against leaders of the Palestinian resistance, to proffer 8 charges against Palestinians versus 7 against Zionists, to seek arrest warrants for 3 Palestinians versus 2 Zionists, to not seek charges against under Article 6 of the Rome Statute, which covers genocide. All of those things are examples of the still dominant imperialist forces within the court. It's particularly outrageous that in these charges, he seeks to charge Palestinian resistance leaders with torture for their actions on October 7th, but has failed to seek any such charges against the Zionist regime, where currently Palestinian prisoners are being subjected to extreme forms of torture. Palestinians from Gaza and Sidi Tamam camp have been subjected to unnecessary amputations, they've photographed their torture. They photographed the stripping of Palestinian men. They photographed the sexual harassment of Palestinian men. Palestinian women have spoken about their experiences of sexual assault by Zionists. They've posted their torture obtained confessions. Palestinian prisoners, for that matter, from the West Bank have been being martyred inside the occupation prisons in unprecedented numbers. They're being starved. They are not being fed. Torture is a daily fact of life for Palestinian prisoners, at the same time that the resistance are using all of their power to actually treat their captives humanely and to keep them safe. It is, in fact, unlike the Zionists, it is in fact the Zionist army that is killing the captives being held by the resistance and not the other way around. They're the ones who are bombing and killing the captives because they don't want to make an exchange deal to liberate the Palestinian prisoners. We hear a lot about the captives of the resistance. They're the ones who are being treated humanely. And yet the ICC wants to charge the Palestinian resistance with torture and leave that charge unaddressed against the Zionist officials. Even Zionist whistleblowers have repeatedly exposed the horrific conditions, the medical abuse, the starvation being used against Palestinian detainees, and yet simply it is unacceptable to international imperialist powers, particularly the United States and the Zionist regime, that the Palestinian resistance holds their captives rather than the other way around. And there is one reason why captives are something that is sought by the resistance forces in the region, and that is because it has been clear time and time again that the only effective way to release Palestinian prisoners from the occupation is to conduct a prisoner exchange. This is the only way in which the Zionists will release the prisoners, will stop sentencing people to 60 life sentences, will stop holding people under administrative detention without charge or trial. It also makes so they've also sought charges of extermination, which while they are being sought against Zionist officials, they're also being sought against the Palestinian resistance, essentially lessening the value of those charges against the Zionists. And they've also actually sought to bring charges of rape as a weapon of war against the Palestinian resistance, once again attempting to enliven an absolutely dead lie that has been told against the Palestinian resistance about the 7th of October. We have been seeing fabricated stories by Israeli NGOs and Israeli politicians, and frankly, extreme right-wing Zionist organizations like Zaka that have been paraded through the US and international media, and every single one of them has fallen apart on scrutiny. The fact that the ICC has sought to bring such charges is both ludicrous and fallacious, and it also makes clear that the indictments of Zionist war criminals are selective, while there's an attempt to assassinate the moral clarity and dignity of the Palestinian and Arab resistance and to target its leadership in total. And of course, we should have all confidence in the resistance's both willingness to sacrifice and its ability to defend itself just as brilliantly in court as it does on the battlefield, and to win decisively in any fair trial. And of course, we should all look forward to seeing Netanyahu and Gallant in the dock for war crimes. But it is clear that the ICC is not an institution into which we can place trust, that equates the indigenous resistance with the illegitimate colonizer. In fact, it is the ICC has consistently failed to hold accountable any of those responsible for the attacks on Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya and Syria, the starvation of Venezuela through sanctions and blockades, the extraction of wealth in Africa, the destabilization and destruction of Haiti, and the mass starvation and genocide in Yemen. And so the ICC has for too long served as a weapon of colonialism rather than as a tribunal of justice. We cannot rely on the ICC to bring justice just as much as we cannot rely on the legal system in the United States or anywhere else to bring us justice. Instead, we can look toward the alliance of the resistance and also challenge ourselves to build our institutions, our movements, and our struggle in order to become a meaningful and worthwhile partner of those resistance forces that are leading the world and are leading the region. It is the resistance that stretches from Iran to Palestine, from Yemen to Syria, to Iraq to Lebanon, but that further stretches to Haiti, to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Eritrea, to South Africa, and to all of the peoples of the world that are fighting back together, to every campus and labor union and organization that is taking the streets and shutting things down for Palestine, to every escalation and action we can and must build our international camp of resistance that is capable of making the axis of resistance larger, stronger, bigger, and broader than ever before, to stand behind and together with the resistance forces as they defend humanity and seek a future in which October 7th is not just one day, but the promise of a future of a world that is free of Zionism, colonialism, imperialism, and their reactionary agents.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for laying out the reality that it's the resistance, and particularly the armed resistance, that sets the path to a new future. Really appreciate it. So at this point, I think we're going to try to take the next 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience, and then wrap up from there. And then the other thing I wanted to I wanted to shout out our co-sponsors, those co-sponsors being Masar Badil, the Palestinian Alternative Revolutionary Path Movement, and also Sami Doon, the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. So shout out to co-sponsors. And this leads me to questions. I actually want to pose one question, though, that I feel like many of you can address, which is this question of international law, right? So, like, is this a question where the lack of a capability to destroy a resistance movement leads to the making of international law that criminalizes resistance, right? So, like, whether that's in Palestine or elsewhere throughout history, right? Like Brahim talked about the sort of criminalization of armed struggle as a sort of result of the revolutions and liberation struggles of the mid-20th century. But like this can also go back to the struggles against slavery, right? Like the early struggles against colonialism in the Americas. Is the role of international law as it's currently constituted to re-legitimize a sort of a particular position that one makes the possibilities of armed resistance, it renders it, like I said, criminal, and therefore it sort of reifies this a liberal project that is therefore in service of imperialism. How do we sort of understand the role of international law, particularly in this moment? Does anybody want to? I think several of you could address this question, but any takers?
Well, I think it's Walter Rodney, the revolutionary Walter Rodney, who once said that international is white law. And I think we need to be very specific about that. The context of international law comes out of, the European colonial project that even begins, when you have this, the establishment of international law. If we go back to the late 1800s, right, in terms of when you have the establishment of, for me, in my case, in terms of thinking about the study of Africa, the Europeans coming together in 1885 at the Berlin Conference in order to actually carve out the African continent in order to not fight each other. And this is where you have some of the beginnings of international law, the consolidation of white supremacy and whiteness, the pan-Europeanism, which becomes a consolidation of white supremacy and whiteness. So international law goes around from slavery, where Europeans interact with each other instead of fighting each other, but really consolidating the colonial project of establishing which areas they'll control, what effective control means. And then you have international law through the mandate system. If people don't know, the mandate system was basically, established in the early 1900s after Germany lost the First World War and the bounty of its colonies that the Europeans took, and then decided that, it would split, create these mandates A, B, C, the former parts of the Ottoman Empire, and then the German former colonies, and then later on, which was split among the European nations. So international law has always been how Europeans deal with one another. It has nothing to do with the rest of us. And I think it's an important thing for us to remember, because when you talk about international law or the idea of the international community, it's not us, it's the white West and its minions in the settler colonial states. And so if we start with that, then we can understand why the UN, for example, can't enforce a ceasefire. We can understand why the UN, for example, is participating in the occupation of Haiti. We can understand how the US can kill 1 million people in Iraq and get away with it. We can understand the destruction of Libya, right? And we can understand what's going on now, because Israel is, the Zionist state is a white supremacist. Zionism is white supremacy. It's a white supremacist state. So then because of that link to whiteness and white supremacy, the Zionist state can get away with killing as many brown people as it possibly can. So that's one way to think about it.
Thank you so much, Jemima, particularly for talking about this sort of the lies that spread through the media. I'll also say that for those of you who are looking for good news that doesn't spread these lies, you might look to, for example, the Resistance News Network, which is on Telegram. You can go there. Al-Mayadeen, english.almayadeen.net provides information from the perspective of the resistance in the region. You might go there as well. Charlotte just posted the website for that. We're out of time, but I'll wrap up with one more question. I'll take my sort of privilege as a moderator to ask one more question. I'm going to pose this question to Alex. So regarding the question of the border, right? Like I've read that this concept that the border is everywhere, that for example, within 100 miles of the actual border of the US is considered a border zone. International airports are considered border zones. The third border with the United States is considered actually the Mexico's border with Guatemala. So what is this notion of the border being everywhere? What does that mean for US imperialism and sort of the way that you were framing the border in terms of the border as a generative side, but also a side of contradiction?
Well, thanks, Navid, for the question. I think this connects to the first question you posed about international law, right? Because there's very specific international law in terms of how to deal with migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees that the United States and other states in Europe and the EU especially choose not to follow. So what they do is they externalize their borders. They push the EU, for instance. They've turned the Mediterranean Sea into a watery graveyard. They use Israeli drones to patrol the Mediterranean Sea. They pay off Libyan militias to serve as Coast Guard, who then trap these migrants and subject them to horrific conditions in these concentration camps in Libya. The journalist Todd Miller has a book called Empire of Borders, where he talks about how the U.S., as their systematic violation of international law in regards to migrants and refugees, is to push their borders farther and farther out, right? So they've created a global empire of borders where they've deputized border patrol throughout much of the world, right? So Mexico, for instance, itself has become a wall. In the last couple months, there's been a precipitous drop in migrant encounters, as the Border Patrol calls it, on the US-Mexico border. The reason that explains that drop is because Mexico is serving as a colonial gendarme for the United States, and they are preventing migrants from reaching the border. So they've created all sorts of military checkpoints throughout the country, and they trap these migrants and bus them back to the Mexico-Guatemala border. And this is part of an arrangement that Obama signed back in 2014 with then President Enrique Peña Nieto. And that builds on like a longer tradition of Mexico serving again as a colonial gendarme of the US when it comes to enforcing US border policy. So I think that the way that the US response to the massive movements of people for a variety of reasons, many of which these reasons have directly tied to US imperial interests and economic warfare, et cetera, is to push their borders out, while internally within the US, they've expanded the unconstitutional lawless zone of borderlands on their own citizens. And it's a weird dynamic, right? So yeah, within the United States, if you're within 100 miles of a border, it can be considered a constitution-free zone. But if you look at the map of the United States, that border includes the Pacific Ocean, includes the Caribbean, includes the Atlantic. So most of the United States population lives within that zone. Therefore, they are subject to the de facto suspension of the U.S. Constitution if it's required for national security purposes or whatever. So it's a dual movement that I see, right? And the figure that exposes this is the figure of the migrant, the figure of the refugee, the asylum seeker who has to risk their lives essentially to reach the US-Mexico border. And along that journey, they expose all the contradictions of so-called international law and what happens to international law when it comes up to US imperial power.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate that answer. And yeah, I totally agree with you. So I guess we're going to wrap up there. Special thanks again to all the panelists for their wonderful presentations. I actually wish we could have more time to ask questions because I do have more questions, but I don't want to keep you all too long. So With that said, again, thank you to the audience for coming, and I wish you all a nice night. Thank you again.